even with all the intellectual and systematic corruption in the State Department review of Keystone, there's now enough public scrutiny that the report itself couldn't be completely bogus. And if one reads it, it makes it very clear that as they say, in a scenario where the world attempts to constrain carbon, Keystone would make a huge difference. The place where they say it makes no difference is if we're making no effort to do anything about climate change and we're just flooding the atmosphere with carbon from every direction. Then they say this little bit more from the Keystone pipeline won't hurt that much. If we're trying to do something about climate change, which theoretically all our governments are committed to doing, then it makes a very big deal. It's the equivalent of adding 6 million new cars to the road. It's also, beyond its powerful practical import at this point, it's a really important and powerful moment of decision for the president and for the Secretary of State. The biggest foreign policy failure of the first Obama administration was almost certainly the catastrophic Copenhagen climate conference, which ended in complete failure. They're aiming for another one in Paris in 2015. For that to be more than just another round of empty promises, someone's actually going to have to say, we're going to leave some fossil fuel in the ground someplace, because the reserves that we've already identified here and around the world have about 5 times the size we'd need to take the planet past the 2-degree red line that our scientists and governments have laid out. That's why Keystone becomes, I think, one of the reasons it's become the biggest rallying point for the environmental movement in generation in this country. It brought more people into the streets than anything else. Partly it's the complete destruction of the boreal forest in Alberta. Partly it's the danger of leaks and spills along the pipeline route. But largely it's the understanding that even if that oil makes it safely to the refinery, it's going to spill into the atmosphere in the form of carbon and help drive global warming yet again. That and the understanding that the president by himself, without asking John Boehner, can stop this project cold should he choose to do so.
So can you talk about why you feel the Keystone XL is such a critical issue, why people are going to Washington in March and planning to get arrested once again, why a few years ago you went to the White House and over 1,200 people got arrested? For people who are not familiar with the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline, why it matters so much?
Well, it's 830,000 barrels a day of oil coming out of Canada and to the Gulf of Mexico to be exported abroad. That's a lot. And it's not just oil, it's the dirtiest oil on the planet. Even the State Department report found that that oil is 10 to 17% more carbon intensive than the other heavy crude that we burn. It's disgusting stuff. It's done disgusting things up north, as the native people who started this fight and are still at its core, as they've pointed out over and over again. And it is a place where the U.S. president could act unilaterally. Nobody's naive. They understand that the U.S. Congress is not going to do anything useful about climate change. That means the president has to do what he said he would do when he ran in 2008. He said, it's time to end the tyranny of big oil. In fact, so far his administration has been very, very helpful to big oil on this continent and around the world. And this is a case where we need him to stand up. For progressives, there's one other not so small thing. There was a study last year showing that the Koch brothers might make as much as $100 billion in profit off this pipeline over its 40-year lifespan. $100 billion. Even for the Koch brothers, a lot of money. And one doesn't have to guess very widely what some of that money, what political use it will be put to in this country.
Bill, I want to turn to Cindy Schild, a senior manager of the American Petroleum Institute's refining and oil sands program. She defended the pipeline on our show earlier this month.
I mean, first of all, you know, we had the debate about whether it's oil sands or tar sands, and quite simply, we're producing oil and gas products. We are not, there's no tar being produced here. So that's just a terminology, depending what side of the fence you sit on.
Bill McKibben, your response?
Well, I don't know. Geologists always called it tar sands. If you want to go up there and look at it, you'll get some sense of what's happening. Basically, what's happening is that her industry is turning a vast swath of area into functional equivalent of, for Tolkien fans, Mordor. I've never seen anything quite like it, and I've seen some pretty bleak environmental disgraces around the world. And in the process, they're going to run up Canada's carbon emissions about 38% between now and 2030, precisely at a time when everyone in the world knows that we need to be reducing carbon emissions. Canada has turned into, or is turning into, a kind of petro state under the Harper government. The same thing is happening in Australia. And in certain parts of this country, with the help of the federal government, the same thing is going on. We're creating huge sacrifice zones, and in the process, creating huge amounts of carbon pollution and huge amounts of wealth. And that wealth is being used to make sure that nothing ever changes politically.
Bill, I want to play a part of President Obama's comments in 2012 when he appeared in Cushing, Oklahoma, to announce his support for TransCanada to build the southern leg of its Keystone oil pipeline from Oklahoma to Texas.
Over the last 3 years, I've directed my administration to open up millions of acres for gas and oil exploration across 23 different states. We're opening up more than 75% of our potential oil resources offshore. We've quadrupled the number of operating rigs to a record high. We've added enough new oil and gas pipeline to encircle the earth and then some. So we are drilling all over the place right now. That's not the challenge. That's not the problem. In fact, the problem in a place like Cushing is that we're actually producing so much oil and gas in places like North Dakota and Colorado that we don't have enough pipeline capacity to transport all of it to where it needs to go.
So, Bill McKibben, if you could respond to what President Obama said, and then talk about further what you said he could do unilaterally.
Well, look, anybody who thinks that the president has been a foe of the fossil fuel industry should just listen to that speech over and over again. Forget the pleasant words in the State of the Union about climate change is the challenge of our time or whatever. That's the real bottom line speech, and the one that'll be remembered, I think, out of his administration. And it came with the promise to expedite all the permits and things for the southern leg of the Keystone pipeline, which is already flowing and already making life worse for people in places like Port Arthur, Texas. Already the victims of really egregious environmental injustice and racism. The president could be doing plenty. He could be making it harder, not easier, for the oil industry. He could be not opening up the Arctic to oil drilling. He could be not opening up big swaths of offshore continental slope U.S. for oil drilling. He could close down instead of continuing to open up more of the Powder River Basin for coal mining. Here's a really important one. These are all important, but the coal industry is trying to build a bunch of massive ports in the Pacific Northwest in order to export coal off to Asia, where it'll do just as much damage, obviously, to the climate as if it was burned here. The federal government has not forced those companies to include the climate effects of those projects in their environmental assessments. All they're looking at is narrow questions of what will happen very close to the ports themselves. The federal government could do that in a minute, and if they did, those ports would never be built. So the Obama administration has done a couple of useful things. They have to do with U.S. automobile mileage and with new controls on power plant pollution in the U.S. that's causing us to burn less coal here a little bit, although our CO2 emissions climbed again last year. But it makes no difference whether we burn this stuff at home or abroad. The secondhand smoke from burning coal is exactly as dangerous to the climate as if we burned it here. So why we somehow think it's okay to export this stuff abroad makes no sense to me. Our first task, second task, third task is to keep as much of it in the ground as humanly possible. It's the only place that it's safe.
America.